So I'm making this video to test out a new TV tuner card that I got that has S-video input, and I'm using it as a capture card for Wii and GameCube footage. And so this is just the default settings. You see it looks a little bit dark by default, but by boosting the brightness and the contrast, I can get it to look really, really close to what I'm seeing on my CRT TV, and that is actually what I'm comparing with. My goal here is to try and get the capture footage to look as close to how it looks on my TV as possible, because I think that looks really good. So for a game like this, I just want the colors to really shine. It doesn't have a lot of dark outlines or anything, and so I tried to set the hue right so that Flood was about the right shade of yellow. By default, it was a little bit too green, I think. And then I wanted the contrast to be just enough so that, like, for example here, the sunset looks really vibrant, but the shadows look relatively dark. Because by default, the shadows just kind of look very bright blue. They're obviously still blue here, but they look more like shadows. And the settings that I settled on, I think, look really good in a lot of various environments of the game, which is what I was going for. For every game, you're going to make some sacrifices. Nothing's going to be perfect, but I feel like with the proc amp settings for this capture card, I was able to really fine-tune it to get what I wanted it to look like. Now, for Tales of Symphonia, the title screen looks great with the same settings with that high saturation, but in the gameplay, it's definitely too much. Like, the dirt just looks almost yellow, so the first thing I did was bring the saturation down a little bit, and the next thing I checked was Lloyd's red was looking a little bit too magenta and not quite fire trucky enough, so I adjusted the hue for this game. And then another thing is, because this is a JRPG, it's very text and menu heavy, I really wanted to make sure that the text was clear, and so I emphasized more on making those outlines speak. So by contrast, the overworld, there aren't a lot of outlines on the models. It's very much communicated by color, so you do want higher saturation on the overworld, but in the menus, I wanted the saturation a little bit lower so that it's mostly the contrast speaking. Now here, this is a really effective demo as to how good the contrast settings are for this capture card. It really effectively communicates depth. That was a really exaggerated example, but I really, really like the contrast settings on this card. I think they are the selling point for it that makes it really possible to get the kind of image that I want. And so I finally settled on some settings that I think look good on the overworld, they look good in battles, they look good in the menus, a kind of balance between not too saturated, not too desaturated, kind of contrast that things are legible and clear, but not so over the top that, for example, the overworld, which doesn't have those outlines, doesn't look good. So the last game that I was testing out was Panel Upon. This is played on an SNES emulator on my Wii, so it's the same console outputting everything. And this was kind of a middle ground between those extremes, because Panel Upon, it's pixel art, and so it does have kind of clear outlines similar to Symphonia, but it's of course a very bright, very vibrant game. And so I kind of wanted to find a middle ground, make sure it was nice and saturated so the colors speak, but also that all of the lines and shapes also speak. One thing that I think was cool is, again, the contrast here. You can use it to determine how visible or invisible the background portraits are. It really, really does help create a sense of depth in basically all of the games, and that's the number one thing that I really liked about this card. So I'm comparing this to the GV-USB2, which was the capture card I was using before. It's a great all-around card, but I found that I wasn't able to quite get things to speak quite as well for this, and I really do think the proc amp settings for this card have a lot to do with that. So you see, like, just a tiny tick on the settings here actually has a huge change in how the game looks, which means that you don't have quite as granular control. And also the contrast specifically, I keep talking about it because it's so true, because the contrast settings for this game really don't help emphasize depth so much. It kind of makes more or less the whole game appear brighter or darker again. And so my favorite settings for this game, it looks pretty close to how the Hauppauge tuner card does look, but it's just, I can't get it quite as perfect, which over the course of a lot of gameplay, I think it really does make a difference. Now, for Sunshine, honestly, I think both of the cards perform very similarly, because in a game like this, I think the outlines are a lot less important and the colors are more important. And in general, I think Sunshine looks just as vibrant on both cards, I think. I wasn't able to find a super compelling difference between the two. But just for some actual direct side-by-sides for both games, I'm going to start out with some GV-USB2 footage and then kind of transition into Hauppauge footage so you can actually see the side-by-side. So here's GV-USB2. It looks fine, but the Hauppauge I think is just a little bit more precise and clear. And especially I love the browns. I could not get the browns to look that good using the GV-USB2. So again, just kind of like a still. This is the GV-USB2, and it's going to transition into the Hauppauge. It's a very, very subtle change for this menu especially, but again, it's just that slight extra clarity and depth. I really like it. So again, here we're starting out with the GV-USB2. It looks good. And then the Hauppauge, I think, again, it just speaks a little bit more. I'm just holding on this frame because I didn't take that much footage here, but I really like those colors by comparison. The GV-USB2 just looks a little bit flatter by comparison, and I'm totally just being an elitist snob here, but I really do think it makes a difference. Now, the last game, as I mentioned, I don't see really much of a difference here. There is a difference, but it's not really worth writing home about, I don't think. Like, you almost can't see where it changes when it's going live like that, so I actually have some stills side by side so we can really be nitpicky if we want to. So again, here's the GV-USB2, and then it's going to transition into the Hauppauge right here. And so, obviously, the colors are a little bit different. There is some slight differences, but it's not as pronounced in this game, I don't think. Again, especially because, for me, the Hauppauge's edge comes with those contrast settings. So, I'm definitely moving forward using the Hauppauge from here on out. I really do love its proc amp settings. I love how much control I have, and I particularly love the contrast. And I know I've been going on and on about it, and I'll show you why shortly. The only drawback for this card is I've had some problems with the audio, but I use a different interface for audio, so it doesn't worry me that much. But, so, what I like about the contrast is it really does emphasize depth and clarity, and a big reason for that. So this is the waveform, and bringing down the contrast, it squeezes the extremes of the waveform, but it preserves the central values, which means that it keeps the clarity in the middle even as you increase or decrease total contrast. And that's important. It's almost acting like a compressor, and I'll compare that to the GV-USB2 in a second. Now, as for the GV-USB2, I will say it is the most painless capture card that I've used. It just works. If you don't want to deal with proc amps, you don't have to. If you just plug it in, it'll work. I've had no problems with it. Also, it's an external USB card, so all you need is a USB 2.0 slot, whereas the Hauppauge is an onboard PCIe card. So, from just a usability standpoint, GV-USB2 beats it out, and honestly, the visuals are very, very comparable. I'm just being nitpicky. But, for example, here, if you look at this contrast, it's squeezing and contrasting the entire waveform, and all of that clarity in the middle is just getting smushed together. And so that's why the contrast doesn't really emphasize detail the way it does on the Hauppauge. And for me, that makes a big difference. For others, it might not really matter. In the end, as I said, GV-USB2, great card, totally serviceable. There's a reason a lot of people recommend it, because it just works.